I'm John DeArmond with the Coquille Group, and today we're going to go over the fundamental motion in shashka work. This is also the primary motion in the rest of the traditional Russian martial arts, and it is called skrutka. Now, skrutka is built into pretty much every motion that we'll be making with the shashka, so it's important to really set it up as a good foundation for our work. This is a good place to mention, since I don't, my knowledge of the Russian language is quite small. Where I know the name of the technique, or where I remember it, I'll share it in Russian. Otherwise, I'll sort of use general Anglicanized words. So, without further ado, let's begin. Performing the motion of skrutka is relatively simple, but we're going to break it down a little bit. And like most of the Russian method, we're going to start with very big motions and refine them to smaller and smaller motions once your body gets the sense of how the motion is supposed to be made. So we'll start off feet shoulder width apart. You can take your shashka or trainer, whatever, hold it on your hips. Your tail is tucked, your head pulls high, your shoulders are relaxed. Now we begin the motion by bringing the knee in towards the other knee. Our hips come with it. Hips and shoulders will stay on the same plane for all of our motions, right? And what we're doing is traveling 180 degrees, or well, 90 degrees to the horizon. Then we come back to the center. And then we repeat with the opposite leg. Knee comes in, hips and shoulders turn 180 degrees. In and back. In and back. Good. Once you have this basic sort of turn of the knee, you want to focus on turning along the center axis. As you go. Avoiding leading strongly onto either foot, right? Nice, in the center, skrutka, right? One foot moves, the other foot moves. Easy peasy. Once you have this central axis turning down, you'll begin to add an element of vertical change. So, in the center, we're at our tallest. As we turn to the side, we come down slightly. Tall, down. Tall, down, tall. And again, in the beginning, we really want to exaggerate these motions, right? So you get this feeling of really just dropping into position. Next, we're going to incorporate the breath, right? So, as a general rule, anytime you expand, you breathe in. Anytime you contract or compress your form, you breathe out. So we start by breathing in at the high position. We breathe out as we go down. We breathe in as we come up. We breathe out as we go down. In, out, in, out, so forth and so on. There is a sort of variation between the different Russian martial arts as to how the breathing should be done. For our purposes, we'll breathe in through the nose, breathe out through the mouth, focusing on the diaphragm, and focusing, as we said before, on the exhalation, right? We breathe out with focus and force, and then we relax and let the air fall in for the inhale. Breathe out, relax. Breathe out, relax. Pretty simple, pretty easy. Once we can put these elements all together, going to narrow the field. We'll take it from 180-degree range to a 90-degree range, right? Real simple, real easy. What you want to look out for as you become more comfortable and start to do the transitions faster is your tail. You want to make sure that your pelvis remains tucked through the turns. The tendency, especially for beginners, is as they come into that crouch, their butt sticks out, their chest sticks out, and their guts kind of pull in, right? So they'll come in, hips come out, hips are out. And they very quickly sort of return to that natural S curve of the spine that we're trying to avoid for our work. Once we've got the 90 degrees down, we'll cut it down to 45, or a little less. Typically we aim for pointing the center line of our body at the outside of an opponent's shoulder range, right? Very simple, very easy. So with that being the basic motion, let's go ahead and take some time to talk about why we do screwtka and how it shapes our work. So, why screwtka? Why this motion? What is it for? What does it do? Why should I bother learning it? Right? With screwtka, we are not only studying sort of the fundamental aspects of the Russian martial arts, our posture, our motion, our breathing, and our relaxation. We're also beginning to study sort of the underlying physical principles of motion itself. This becomes more evident once we begin to add arm motion into it. So, as we begin to move, we let the arms relax, and they come side to side, right? If I want them to be low, I create a gentle whip, right? If I want them to be high, I create a more snappy whip on the hips return. Wah! I am not manually manipulating my arms in this kind of fashion, right? I am letting the arms hang dead and loose so that I can study the feeling, right? Specifically the feeling of the wave. Now, what is the wave, right? It's a central part to Russian martial arts, and it's basically this idea that you can create a long whip of your kinetic force, bah, and rapidly accelerate the tip of the whip, just like with a bullwhip. Now, people can have a difficult time acquiring this work because the tendency is either to be entirely sort of so loose that you have no structure, and that you may hit with impact, but you don't have the structure to make sure that the impact travels into the target, right? Or, on the opposite side, people are trying to do it all mechanically. Shoulders moving away from the hip line, engagement of the large muscles of the shoulder and bicep and forearm, right? This does not produce optimal results either, right? It just becomes a large motion, arbitrarily large, that doesn't necessarily do more damage in relation to the time and distance it takes to travel, right? Because in fighting, regardless of the type, when we look at how to become more efficient, what we're looking at is fundamentally how much power can we impart into the target for how little effort, right? And in how much distance traveled. Because The distance that a piece of work takes to travel is directly how we perceive its speed. Work that comes a long distance is slow, work that comes a short distance is fast, irregardless of the sort of meters per second or miles per hour that the work is actually moving. This, of course, would change if we had greater range, but at close personal contact, it doesn't really matter so much. So, with screwtka, we're looking at observing and feeling in our own body the sort of peak of that wave as it moves through us. With practice, you get quite accustomed to the feeling, this sort of dead, loose, heavy hand. But this is just skill building training. This is not, you don't and fight one guy like that, right? When you're fighting more than one person, especially when they're sort of juxtaposed, we do similar work, but it's not the same at all, right? And it doesn't even look the same to a trained eye. So don't imagine that this is how you're fighting, because it's not, right? What we want to do is we want to get used to the feeling of the apex of that kinetic wave so that we can begin to time our work so that the apex of the force is in our fist or in our tool when we strike the target, right? If we strike it before, the work collapses under the load of the sort of peak of the motion, and it just kind of like slaps off through the person. It's not very powerful, right? If we let it go too long, we're just spending extra time, right? It doesn't, we lose that initial snapping peak of power, and it slowly trails off. You still hit strongly, but it's a little wasteful, right? With the sword, the work is the same, right? You turn, just like with your arms, nice and loose. The difference being that with the sword, because it has the extra weight, it's much easier to feel. The centrifugal force pulls it much sooner, right? And you get that sense of the sort of transfer of power, the movement of force through it, right? And it becomes the work for your cutting, right? Now, there are other uses for screwtka, right? Other ways in which this motion has been employed as sort of a technical or tactical device, including evasion, right? The person comes to strike, and rather than staying in that central position, I take my step, whoop, and I narrow my field, bringing my attack and defense into one motion. It can be used, obviously, to strike with the sword, the hand, but also the rest of the body, right? In the form of body checks, in the form of takedowns, even in close wrestling, standing or high wrestling or sort of grappling on the ground. The same work can be done if you understand how to use your hips as the beginning point rather than your knees, which most people find a little bit more natural. Anyway, so with that, let's go ahead and let's call that good for screwtka for right now. And in the next video, we'll begin to look at cutting techniques and how sort of screwtka interacts with them, right? As always, if you want to understand this work, you got to pick up a sword and go train.